Welcome to Evolution Hour, our latest installment. Clickety-clack, steampunky. Thank you, Peter, for having come up with this really swell graphics. TortuganWordPress.com, in case you haven't noticed, is a website where there's a whole slew of my earlier works that I did. Yikes, it's coming on like 20 years ago. Nonetheless, it's the cute, fun stuff that I did before I got into the realm of doing A, the video things, and B, these exciting little books that allow people to have like a hard copy of things on a scale that really hadn't already done all that well. Well, as you know, I'm continuing to plow through the source analysis for Jonathan Sarfati and Joel Tay's Titans of the Earth, Sea, and Air, which is a creationist version of dinosaur paleontology. And it's pretty pictures. And just how many sources does it have? Well, that's what we're plowing through. At last, I'm calling this some shoes drop. Finally, we get a little bit of meat on the bones. The work is going into a great deal about how big dinosaurs were, which is not in and of itself a pro-evolution or pro-creation thing. But some of the papers that they are alluding to discuss more than just this bulk and how big. Sarfati and Tay are trying to just kind of wave around about, ooh, how gigantic dinosaurs were. And of course, this will relate to like behemoth and all of those sorts of issues. But a lot of the difficulties involve that some of these very large sauropods that are discovered, as you will discover from looking at the technical papers that I'll be putting the links up to. Hi, Vesta. Often they're very fragmentary. Sometimes you've got the bulk of the body, but there's no neck involved. Sometimes it's just an isolated vertebrae, as in one infamous case that some of the papers are going into, which of course goes into the issues about forensics. Another important thing to remember about these papers is that none of it, zero, is being done by creationists. So they're not contributing to anything. These are purely kibitzers from the side, even though they do actually have a few creationist paleontologists. I mean, you got Kurt Wise, you've got, yipes, his name is Marcus Ross, and the like, that theoretically could be doing things. And there's a small cadre of geologists rather than strictly paleontologists from Loma Linda University, which is at Seventh-day Adventist College, that they do digs and things every once in a while, but they're not exactly the heavy hitters on the field. Anyhow, oh, and let me get another little task out of the way, which will be our patrons, to remind everybody that there is a patron project to help the little old project coming along. And every one of you that keeps a plugging in financially stressed times and with all the ups and downs that everybody has to worry around, I'm very much appreciative of all the help that all of you out in the YouTube land have done to keep the old RJ slunking along, because I couldn't do it without your help. And every bit makes a big difference on here. I wish I were pulling down as much as, I can't even imagine pulling down as much as Steve Meyer does. He has upgraded. I see there was a posting that somebody took note of, that Meyer has gone from like 150 grand at the Discovery Institute to 200,000 he's pulling down now. Isn't that wonderful? Even I think Jonathan Wells has a little stipend of $100,000 a year at the Discovery Institute. So nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you lie, or rather say things that aren't true, but which you believe to be true, especially if you're getting paid $100,000 a year. I will stipulate, I don't think anybody on the payroll at the Discovery Institute or Answers in Genesis or others is being duplicitous. I'm willing to grant all of them really do believe everything they say. And though I'm sure they really feel they earn that money in a way that I don't think could be anywhere near as much earning as that amount of money is. But anyway, neither here nor there. So I'll mention part 2 to get that kind of out of the way before going back to these other little papers, which has to do with a posting from Michael Ord in 2021 from creation.com, where he is trying to make a great deal of hay out of a paper on whether or not there was polar wandering in the late Cretaceous. And by which we are talking about the actual rotation pole or the magnetic pole, rather. Not quite the same thing, are they? And so this issue is how much of that polar wander is going on versus magnetic pole information. How do you know what a pole is unless you're kind of connecting it up with ancient paleo poles and all the rest? It's a complex issue and relates also to how continents fit together and all of that. So there's a paleogeography issue, which Ord is not going out of his way to call attention to. Anyway, the paper in question is in Nature, and I'll be putting up a link to that so you can compare Ord's version with the Mitchell paper and see which one of them is paying attention to more data and which one has better a case to deal with. Discovery Institute should really be called the Dishonesty Incorporated. Yeah, they're an interesting little bunch. For those unaware of the history of the Discovery Institute, it didn't start out as an anti-evolution bunch. It started out and remains a very conservative think tank, pro-business, not fond of environmentalism, good old-fashioned free market economics. In fact, Michael Behe, back before he was so wildly known for bacterial flagella and the Darwin's black box stuff, the first post I remember seeing from him from the 1990s, and it's gone, I believe now, it's been cleaned away, but he was advocating the privatization of Social Security. So this gives you some idea of the very conservative aspect of this. Bruce Chapman, who founded the Discovery Institute and is still associated with it, he ran unsuccessfully for governor in our state quite a few times, is a very politically conservative person, I presume fairly religious, and that got connected up with the anti-evolution crusade in the mid-1990s, and it's been running that way ever since. So now they're connected at the hip with those aspects, and in some respects they're more prominently known for their anti-evolution intelligent design stuff than they would be for the political conservative seminars on business policies and tax policies, which they also still do. If you look around in the little corners of the Discovery Institute postings, and that's going on. And they're connected up with the Amundsens, that very conservative, I think they're from the insurance industry, that funneled a big stipend to the Discovery Institute. It's been quite a few years ago, and I'm not sure how much money they're raking in and from who details, but presumably there is an element of money bags underwriting of the things, but they also have their product lines. They got their little books they sell. I've even bought a few over the years that add to my reference field. I would prefer not to, but there you go. In some respects, you have to acquire some of that stuff that way, just like this Sarfati and Tay book, because they're not necessarily at the library. So I'm not sure really how much of the more recent Discovery Institute content, the kind of stuff that Casey Luskin and that is involved with, and that they have on sale at the various conferences and things that they do around, how much of that actually makes much penetration in the secular world. Not really. You get old favorites like Darwin's Black Box and Darwin on Trial and that sort of thing that have been in the libraries because they kind of they're a little bit more mainstream in terms of publication. So anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. So back up to our Sarfati and Tay dinosaur content. Now, a chunk of the papers, there's a one from Carpenter, from 2006, Kenneth Carpenter. He plays a kind of a funky little role in some issues. He was involved, as I recall, with some of the flirtations with the Proto-Avis case that I alluded to some of that, I think, in the Evolution Slam Dunk. I don't think we mentioned much of it in Rocks Were There, but because it's kind of a sidebar, we're talking about back in the 1990s. I mean, this is a fairly old issue because, of course, dinosaur bird connections have much more important things to deal with than the old Proto-Avis case. I certainly discussed it at the website. You can download the three macroevolutionary episodes, or also there's quite a bit on the bird material in the Dynamania chapter from the old tip. So there's a whole bunch of stuff, and you can download all the PDFs and all that stuff, all absolutely freebie. Naturally, I want everyone to buy the books too. We can use the royalties, and plus they're good reads. Anyway, Carpenter's paper from 2006, which is on this particular old fossil that Cope found back in the 19th century, great big vertebrae, single bone, and how big was the critter that it belonged to? Hard to ascertain, and so there's been some back and forth on this. There's a 2014 paper on that same taxon as to the back and forth as to how they were dealing with it, and then a one from 2015 from the Royal Society also on large dinosaurs. None of those contain any discussion of the systematics or paleogeography issues, which slams into the worldview of young Earth creationism. So those I'm listing in my spreadsheet analysis as non-controversial. They're not misrepresenting anything in it. Some other papers are different, though. So and it's interesting that these tend to be more recent still. So there's a paper on phylogeny and biogeography that comes up in Lacovara 2014. That's from Nature. There's Carbalido 2017 from the Royal Society, and Kenneth Carpenter again from 2018 on that same taxon that he's been discussing all over these years. And the point is that those papers all relate some stuff to the systematics of how the sauropods are related, and in many cases where they lived, as in North America versus the disjointed taxons that are found in a different time frame in other sections of the Paleozoic or Mesozoic world. Now, that therefore brings up the interesting prospect of what exactly is the creationist interpretation for any of these things. Why are these taxa found where they are? What was the paleo world in the pre-flood environment? Because all of this stuff has to be pre-flood. They're critters that were wandering around in the pre-flood world and then get buried in the big slosh muck. What's the world involved? You will look in vain for, at least I certainly haven't spotted anything yet in the Sarfati book that gives a detailed breakdown of what the paleo world was according to their model. And they don't have to claim that their model would be necessarily the model of ICR or AIG, but you'd think Sarfati and Tay ought to have a model. And if there is a dispute over what the paleo worlds look like according to the creation model, then let's maybe discuss that. And so there's so much that's being brought up by those papers that everybody can then keep in mind, and I will certainly be keeping in mind as we move along down to the meat of the story when they're starting to get into the actual taxes to find out how all of that's fitting together. I'm not holding my breath on that one. 33rd winning anniversary. Yay! Happy anniversary. My birthday, by the way, is coming up this week. I'm going over to my niece's for a little party over there. And I've heard on my birthday, September 22nd, the second coming rapture is taking place. At least according to a little blurb that was being passed around from a particular religious group that they got another revelation. So September 22nd is it. Put it on your calendars. Yep. We'll see little bodies floating away into the sky or being disappeared suddenly, and it will be so exciting. And it'll be such a fascinating thing. And boy, wouldn't it be surprising if I was among the group getting raptured? Wouldn't that frost some nuts? But spoiler alert, I don't think that's going to happen. So we're not worried about that. Yeah, they have a model other than God done it. That's an interesting question, because if you look at the Discovery Institute, and for that matter, Old Earth creationism, which for all practical purposes is reason to believe Hugh Ross and company, that no, they don't really have a model. The creator creates, the designer designs, and something happened in the past. The few rare examples of where Ross can't avoid kind of coming up with a model makes it preposterous, like his attempt to peg the flood to like 50,000 years ago, or the ideas about just exactly what was going on with the animals and when Adam and Eve lived and all that kind of stuff. That when he does try to bump into those things, it starts bogging down in a mess that is really quite surprising. That they don't discuss that stuff more, because they can't really apply anything, because they have to accept the standard chronology, and trying to shoehorn that into Genesis is not really going to work very well. Meanwhile, over in intelligent design land, they just don't think about it ever. So there is zero systematics. They complain about speciation and biogeography and some of these issues, but it's all a negative argument. They don't have an argument of themselves. They don't have an argument as to how many flagella designs were there and when this took place. They don't have any idea of how many design events that were occurring during the Mesozoic, which would involve the development of placental mammals. It would involve the development of birds. There's an awful lot of stuff going on during the Mesozoic, tremendous proliferation in crocodiles. And so in order for you to work out whether anything is related to anything, you'd have to have some standard of how speciation operates in the real world. And then you've come into the awkward problem that if you start figuring, if you take an arbitrary animal that existed in the past and think about how much change could occur according to what we can see happening with species in the existing world, variation that we find in felids, for example, variations that we find in canids, variation that we find in alligators, variations that we find in birds, etc., all extant species and their close bits, which your young Earth creationists are going to be regarding as discrete families, but still with a proliferation of species within them. They're facing this problem theoretically too. They have a different set of bottlenecks, but theoretically, you could take a critter and figure out how much variation could take place before and afterwards, and see, are you reaching a stage where you're bumping into a later fossil or an earlier fossil that could very well then be part of that lineage? Intelligent designers never do that, ever. And so their systematics is always not Darwin. Nope. No. And that's as far as it goes. Some really odd. Oh, yes. There's a section in some of the stuff in TIP that I took. I can't remember whether it was like I brought it up in maybe TIP 1.6 or 1.7, one of those areas. And there's also allusions to it in the other various books that crocodiles that we see now, alligators and that bunch, were much more varied during the Mesozoic. We're seeing just a tiny little remnant group, because you had fully aquatic crocodiles, you had terrestrial sprinters, the Lagasucids, that you had a hell of a lot going on. And there's every reason to think that their heart systems are kind of a trimmed down, less active version of a functionally powerful, more mammal-like heart system in Mesozoic crocodiles. All of which is information which, for all practical purposes, the intelligent design movement paid zero attention to, and for that matter, the young Earth creationists pay virtually no attention to. They're off them in the mark. So, at least if you move over to young Earth creationism, there is theoretically a systematics that they're playing with, and It's because they're forced into it because of their creation model. So unlike intelligent designers that can have the creator creating vaguely somewhere in the past and somehow or other things came about that made the things that we have now, please don't bother me. There's no wiggle room in young earth creationism. All kinds are created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago-ish. They can debate about when that ish was, but still, that's the creation week. No creation after that. None. Zip. Zero. Nada. Not a single new kind is created after the creation week, which means once human beings appear on the scene, we're the last created, there is no further creation. Everything that exists is a variation within already created kinds. So that is a mess to try to deal with the fossil record of the stuff they think is taking place before the flood and the fossil record and extant species that they think is taking place after the flood. So everything in the fossil record, like all of those dinosaurs that you will be reading about in the papers that I'll be putting the links up to, are ones that had to have proliferated from whatever the created kind was. And then it gets obliterated in the flood. Although there had to have been that kind aboard the ark, so there must have been a gigantic sauropod kind, maybe a little teeny baby. That's the argument that Dwayne Gish and others use. And then that group is coming off the ark and proceeding on to immediately become extinct, because all of those kinds, even by the ark encounter standards, have gone extinct, although they kind of tease around that these critters were still known to people afterwards, and that there are pictures of sauropods on medieval English tombs and a whole bunch of stuff. And needless to say, we're going to have a nice section on all of that in volume 2 of the Rocks Were There, because it's just a maniacally strained set of apologetic dodges that are going on in that analysis. The thing will be the extent to which the creationist systematics can never account for all the data field, which then brings up the issue of whether the intelligent designers or old earth creationists could ever, in any form, come up with a workable systematics. They, of course, would be facing an awkward problem, because they would have, or would they, creation events going on all through the geologic record, and creation events in order that isn't matching up with Genesis, which is something that the young earth creationists make a big deal out of, that birds are on one day versus the human beings coming up somewhere else. And the sequencing of events is such, well, they don't have much help from Genesis, because remember, Genesis is not a geology text and it's not a zoology text. It's not a systematic analysis. They just vaguely allude to critters along the way. And so modern creationists have to kind of interpolate stuff in there, and it leads to quite a mess. You can see why Steve Meyer isn't going to try to do any intelligent design systematics, because he would have to commit himself to, are there created types or not? You'd think that Michael Denton would have made some headway on this. My God, he's been writing crap since the 1980s. And still, if you bump into him, and I have, he's no farther along now than he was in Evolution, a Theory in Crisis from 1985. That he can't give up that lure of typology, that there are created types and kinds. He doesn't use the word kinds, he sticks with types. Vaguely in the way, in many respects, he's in the same level of vagueness that Richard Owen was back in the 1850s and 60s, because he was an anti-Darwinian, and he kind of thought of vague archetypes that would be involved in animals, but yet he then would think nothing about it afterwards. But it ain't 1855 anymore. And we know a heck of a lot more about how critters work, and homeobox genes, and the genes of, in case some in actual extinct animals, that we can look at directly and make analyses on, just like we can see Neanderthal genomes. And that all is information which would need to be accounted for in any anti-evolution model, whether it's young Earth creationist or intelligent design. But we're not getting that. And I would contend we're never gonna, because the intelligent designers and old Earth creationists are never really going to be able to get past their stumbling block of the pitfalls of being specific. And the young Earth creationists can't get away from their young Earth creation model, which doesn't allow them any wiggle room. So it's going to be fun kind of to see. I would have at least thought that Sarfati and Tay would be honest enough to just present a bloody list of dinosaur kinds. I mean, it's maybe 20-ish, maybe more, if we're going by dinosaur families. Although one of the funky little things about stuff is, and we'll be calling attention to this in the systematics chapter on the arc encounter kinds, is that in some cases, things have gotten repositioned in modern systematics as to what family they're in. And in one case of some invertebrates, which of course don't pop up in creationist lexicon because they didn't have to be on the ark, so we're not going to think about them. There was an example of an invertebrate that was regarded as two separate phyla that get merged together now as a family. Whoops, there's a shuffleboard, because you started getting some actual living examples. Now you can look at their genes and we can, oh, well, that makes sense of that, blah, blah, blah. That kind of systematic shuffleboard is inevitable when you have a limited data field over time and you get more blips on the scope to where now you go, oh, something that was seemingly disparate, actually connects up with that, and now we can make sense out of it. But in a fixed kind framework, I have a problem dealing with that level of stuff. And we've even got some stuff, I alluded to it in the earlier section on Jensen stuff, and we'll be incorporating that in the new book, about how Jensen is riffing at one point off of a listing of kinds of basically mammal families that's based on evolutionary insights, to where some groups have been lumped together in a new family because of evolutionary data. So he's incorporating the evolutionary material without even realizing it, which, by the way, is different from what you find in Answers in Genesis in the Ark Encounter. So depending upon which version or who's stealing what from Wikipedia, they're not at all clear about how many kinds there are. Ark Encounter is at least interesting in that they have had to ballpark things down at a really low level. They bit the bullet and decided to outrun John Whitmore, who had a much higher quantity of kinds in the tens of thousands. And they must have realized that they're not going to be able to cram that many into the bloody ark, no matter how many little babies they think to bring aboard. And so theirs is a ridiculously low 1,400, which is effectively running through families. It's going to be funky to deal with some of the stuff on amphibia and all the cute little material on the reptilia. And of course, they've even listing them in the sequence is so revealing as to when they refer to the mammal-like reptiles as a separate cluster. And that's the thing that it is going to be really amusing to go into in the fiddly bit details, because they made the mistake from a scholarly point of view, from my annoying person's point of view, they blundered in how they listed the kinds on their listing. Because by definition, kinds aren't related to. So why are they grouping all the mammal kinds together and all the dinosaur kinds together and all the bird kinds together? Yes, the more confused their picture gets. Yeah, exactly. Why are they listing them in clusters, first off? But it's worse than that. It's why aren't they in alphabetical order? Kinds are all separate. So why not list them conveniently in alphabetical order? since they are by definition unrelated to one another. Why are they listing them in the order that they are, which is non-alphabetical? And spoiler alert, it's because they're copying evolutionary systematics, that they're listing the critters in the order that they're popping up, probably, well, in the various technical papers that they don't tell us what they are, but the technical papers that get relied on Wikipedia allows us to see a mirror image of what those systematics are. And I have found again and again and again and again and again, the order in which the critters are being depicted is their order in systematic relationship according to standard evolutionary thinking. So buried in that wacky little list is a pile of evolutionary assumptions, which we can't figure out the details of how they have gotten to be where they are, because one, they do not post the bloody picture, other than just in a print so small that if you try to blow it up, you can't really read much detail. And so all the versions that I've had to get, because I haven't been to the Ark Encounter to do a clickety-click myself, but Gutsip Gibbon was there, and there have also been some other people who have been there who have taken higher resolution pictures. And between them and what I was able to look at and all the stuff, I've now got a master listing of the entire Ark Encounter list. And I'm now proceeding as well to go through, particularly in relation to mammals, to figure out what stuff is there and are they leaving anything out, and have there been new families that have come along or reevaluation of what is a family and what isn't, to try to get a better sense about who they're riffing off of and how much of it is as superficial as simply riffing off of Wikipedia, as opposed to looking at technical literature on the point. Because depending upon which paper you look at, the Wikipedia listings on how many mammal genera and that there are, for example, will get all of that information, but they have multiple sections because newer systematics have reclassified the groupings of things as they have treated stuff like Aphroditeria and some of these newer structures, so that a group that's in a unified cluster will be connected up to a different group that's been reevaluated because of newer information. So whether you're looking at a systematics from, say, 1990 versus systematics from 2015 makes a difference. And because some of these things can be interesting from a historical point of view, you get multiple listings on it. So if we had the Ark Encounters map of their critters and the sources they use in documentation and their justifications for why they're treating them as specific kinds, we could dive into that and have a lot of fun. But they don't do that. So it's a fog bank. Why did they come up with the list they did? And why is it in the order that they are? And who is compiling it and all the rest? Some of the stuff is fairly obvious. The bird kinds are most probably lifted from Leitner, because she did quite a long, extensive list on that, basically jumping into the families. But other areas in relation to why the amphibia are what they are, and a lot of these paleo groups of reptiles, that's going to be funky, funky, funky. So it's going to be kind of interesting. We'll be bumping into that kind of from a sidebar as well on systematics on whales. Jackson's going to be handling the main section on whale evolution, of which there is so much nice stuff. And that, of course, also connects up with kinds, even though theoretically, all of marine organisms should be worked out in a barometrological framework, but given how many invertebrates there are and how many insects there are, don't hold your breath on that one. There's just too many critters flitting around in there, and I think their little ANOPA programs and stuff would just blow a gasket if they tried to make much sense out of it. But it would be very amusing, and I'm sure Joel Duff and various other people would be doing commentaries on it if they ever get around to dealing with it. But I'm not expecting that to be the case. So what that means is you have an increasingly moving target of the evolutionary systematics as newer studies are done on taxa that the creationists have paid no attention to at all. So what would be their option since they don't have a structure to work from, they would just have to kind of steal the information from the latest technical paper and then try to run it through their little programs to make their little nested boxes to keep them separate. And at that point, you're in the same ballpark that you can see from Todd Wood and Kurt Wise and the like, as to what information they're leaving out and how much fossil data are they leaving out versus how much genetic information are they leaving out from extant organisms. We could see that if they ever got around to looking at it, but I'm not anticipating that's ever going to happen. And I will predict none of that on any taxa whatsoever will be done by any intelligent designers or the physics-oriented bunch over at Reasons to Believe. So that's going to be a funky little thing. We're having a kind of a cool down here in Spokane, which is kind of nice. And I'm glad I got my lawn edging and mowing out of the way, so I don't have to worry about that while I have my little sojourn in Seattle. Depending upon how long I stay over there, the next week's show might be from my niece's Montessori schoolroom, like I have done on occasion, but we'll find out what the circumstances are on that, because if I come back after a weekend, then I would be over there on a weekend. So we'll ponder what that is. And this is what 71 years old looks like, kids. And we'll see what I'm like at 81, 91, 101. You know, how far can the RJ go? I have a lot of books continuing to write, a lot of things to do, a lot of projects to deal with. And of course, since creationists seem to have no limit as to how much they can repeat the same claptrap over and over again. A thing I'll mention, I put a link up on Twitter about it, that Zach Hancock did an analysis, a book review of John Sanford's genetic entropy book. And those of us who have been kind of bumping into the thing, I had a copy of genetic entropy, and what struck me about it was how sparsely it was documented. It was clearly not a sophisticated thing. At least Jensen, in his books, has a few hundred sources. You know, he's got a little bit of meat to it. He misrepresents them like mad, but nonetheless, at least he's got a higher level of source base on it. And even Rupin Sanford's claptrap had a hell of a lot of sources, as I've spotted and also Gutsick Gibbon. But Sanford's book didn't look particularly impressive. Just exactly how crash and burn bad, though, it was obvious after Zach Hancock did his autopsy, because population biology and population genetics is his field. He's a doctorate in it. So he knows this stuff inside out. And it's gobsmackingly dismal how far from the data field and how smarmy smug Sanford was at several points that I wouldn't have spotted, but holy smokes, was Zach get his dander up about it, because that's his field. And the sheer arrogant dismissal of population biologists is not very important. There are not many of them. They don't really do anything, and nobody pays attention to them anyway. Nope. And so the details of all the assumptions that are built into Sanford's argument are wrong. That he's just flat out wrong. And we can see that he's wrong empirically based upon actual scientific field in works that, for all practical purposes, Sanford pays no attention to. Now, then you've got downstream all of those creationists that just love Sanford's book. Woo, genetic entropy gets mentioned all the time. It gets cited all the time. And you've got little hangers-on like Standing for Truth and others who repeat this as if it is a thing. And it gets waved in because it's an argument that there would be continual degradation of genomes that can only be implying that everything is quite young because the Earth is only 6,000 years old. That's some of the subtext that goes on in why they like genetic entropy. The problem is that if genetic entropy were happening, some of the stuff, the mutation rates are such that organisms should be extinct by now, and they aren't. And that's because genetic entropy is not a thing. And absolutely nobody in the regular scientific genetic community pays the slightest attention to genetic entropy. And yet over in creationism land, it's just really constant. Now, something else to remember is that Sanford is connecting up with the intelligent design movement, very tiptoe-ish. But over the last decade, there have been a variety of works that have been done on information in genetics and supposedly how this is designed. And Sanford and people in that same grouping are publishing in these air quotes intelligent designy contexts. Sal Cordova has slid into that same route, coming in through the old now defunct evolution thing that Bill Dembski had. But they're not attempting to do anything in the regular scientific literature. Instead, they're simply repeating the kind of little tropes they've got in that area. And it's going to be really funky to see as continually the time goes on as to just how far out on that genetic entropy limb they're wanting to go and how far removed they are. But anyway, they're going to have to get past Zach Hancock on this matter. We'll be referencing it and some of the technical papers that Zach brought up, including one from 2021 that is relevant to this point, in a little box because genetic entropy in the new book, because genetic entropy gets waived as some of the evidence against evolution. That's part of the little tropes. There's been a bunch of compendium that have been done effectively by young Earth creationists. There's several big ones that I alluded to in the first rocks were there. And there are ones where they're saying that the 10 or 20 or 15 or however many evidences against evolution. And we're making a point to pick off every one of them to be alluded to in the course of the text. And about half of it got covered in the first book, and the other half, which a lot of it relates to cosmology issues, are going to be showing up in volume 2. And including all of the neat stuff on the human evolution material that, oh, my. Joel Duff was just scratching his head over some stuff that Frank Sherwin, who was trying to argue that Neanderthals are pre-flood, and the mess that is for the young Earth creationist position, because it's not even connecting up with some of their own apologetics. So is Frank Sherwin paying attention to Frank Sherwin? It's hard to tell. And so that's also a mind that anybody that's looking in the creationism field should be mindful of what other creationists think. So you can often reveal a great deal by looking at a topic from the point of view of not only what apologist A says, but B and C and D and E, and discover how much variation there is. One of the things that's going to be a real scoop, and I was even surprised at how much of variation there was, has to do with the dating of the flood. And there's going to be a neat chart that has gotten longer and longer and longer as I've added more material to it in the process of writing. But when did the flood take place? And the standard that you get in Answers in Genesis Apologetics and ICR mainly is 2348 BCE as the ideal. And that's stemming from Bishop Ussher's calculation. That's the version they prefer. Well, you've occasionally, anybody that's probably been familiar with this field will know you get a couple different dates that some think of. And so I've started to keep track of all of these things. Alluded to in the first volume about one particular writer, Brown, who managed to move the flood 1,000 years in his own framework from one article to another back in the 1990s. But it's way worse than that. And when you start looking at all the different dates that you can come up with, depending upon when you date Adam and which versions are you using, are this using the Septuagint or the Masoretic text, etc., and all of that, you can have these things ranging over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or more of years. And there's been a just ballpark all over the place. And these variations are occurring even quite recently. So you'll see this very elaborate breakdown chart that will give you some material, and there will be an info box that will go into all the little fun and games on it. So In any topic that pops up, those who are interested in crocodiles, start using that as a focus. Any area that you find intriguing. It sort of it came up in a back door because there's another date that's important to remember in creationist apologetics. It isn't being discussed in Rocks Were There because we're not going into theology matters, although generally alluded to it just kind of off in the side. And that is, when was the Exodus? And that too has a dating that is a traditional dating, roughly 1450 BCE. If you look at kind of the Bishop Ussher range of it, and that pops up 1500-ish BCE in an awful lot of stuff. So we're getting a flood of dates for the flood. Yeah, exactly. There's an absolute flood of dates for the flood. It's just hilarious. I think everybody that is familiar with how Answers in Genesis likes to say, oh, 2348, there we go, it's all settled. It's in Genesis, there's no debate, would be just rolling in the aisles at how varied this has been and how many different people weigh in on this subject using the same texts, and they arrive at such varied dates. It's just a scream. I was not expecting there to be that much variation on it, because you would think if the texts were as routinely tidy as the creationists insist, there wouldn't be, you could say, well, there's the biblical position, which is clear, and then there is the non-biblical position that is apostates and they're not using our analysis. But no, it's biblical position A and biblical position B and biblical position C and D and E and F and G, all coming up with variations. The Exodus thing comes into that same ballpark. Which is the Pharaoh of Exodus? When did it take place? Even if you end up taking the traditional 1450 BCE route, which, by the way, no regular scholar in Bible chronology accepts. They have recognized that it is much later, during the New Kingdom, around 1200, and that they can't find any evidence for any precursor thing. All the context of, like, the conquest of Canaan and all of that, the archaeology doesn't support their position. And of course, the creationists insist, oh, no, it fits just perfectly fine. But the problem is the Egyptian chronology. And you get the need, they've got to compress the creationist chronology to fit into the flood model, for one. And two, they've got to figure out how to calibrate it so they can have the right Pharaoh for the Exodus. And which one is that? Is it Tutmosis III? Is it who? Which one? Ramesses? Which one? Yeah. Who? What? And so there's a whole array of people who have taken positions over the years about this thing, which you tend not to know about, because the average creationist apologist is just presenting their little version of things, and they don't pay attention to anybody else. So the Exodus is a very revealing little date on there, because there's about a 250-year difference between the traditional date and that of the regular scholarly date. And that, therefore, is an instantaneous measuring stick that, rather than always focusing on when the flood is happening, to find out how religiously conservative and traditionalist the person is, ask them when the Exodus took place. And if they're falling into that 1500 BCE range, they're a traditionalist. If they are mentioning 1200-ish, then there's somebody that's relating to the modern framework, and they probably ain't going to be a young earth creationist. Needless to say, you don't get a hell of a lot of detail going on over in intelligent design land, where they don't really bother too much about this kind of stuff. A chronology is not their friend, and that's hence they don't do it much. Whereas, kiddos, I am a historian. I'm always a historian, and I'm always going to be a historian. I think chronologically. My big pile of CDs behind me, from the top down, they're all filed in chronological order. So the upper shelves, you can see those little two green thingies right above my head that I had to put in. I put in some cards covering over the the composer listings at that point because the light was shining too much off of it, since I've now moved the laptop over to this spot to do the videos. And the light was getting on to make it backlighting. I look even more death warmed over than I do this way. Man, this is as good as it's going to get. Anyhow, the little green cards up there are covering over the early stages of the Romantic era. And so you've got, although actually there's a couple shelves up above that. So we're about down into Joachim Roth period, composers born in the 1820s, 30s, starting to get into that area. And then there's below those green cards are a mass of the late Romantics all the way into modernists. And for me, I've always filed things chronologically. So I wouldn't dream of putting Bach and Bartok and Beethoven and Brahms in a grouping because they're all starting with B. They belong to the Baroque and the classical and the modernist, and Beethoven's in a little class by himself, dividing the classical and the Romantic era. So I put everybody in the birth year that they are. And that allowed me to make relationships and things and see connections between composers that I wouldn't have had. Well, you get into exactly the same situation when you're looking at the fossil record. How is it possible to even claim to make sense out of the fossil record if you don't know what was living and when it lived, so that you would be constructing a chronological framework of organism A and organism B and organism C? And if you start reading any of the actual serious literature, you're going to be finding out about the issues of paleoclimate and paleoecology and what plants were alive at the time and what the river drainage systems were in relation to things, and all the inferential clues that are putting together paleo worlds that these organisms are living in. Then you move over to the creationist side, and it's gone. Even though there would have been paleo worlds in their model for the young Earth creationists, there would have been a created world that was starting out perfect, and then there is the flood, and then there is the Ice Age, that's the dogma. And all of that is taking place in a chronological frame in which every one of those data blips that is in the regular scientific material would need to be incorporated somehow. But it isn't, because they leave most of that out. And then you go over to intelligent design, creationism light, where they don't even do that. No sense of chronology whatsoever. It's a highly revealing thing to me that Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute, that gets prattled on PragerU videos, did a paper on the Cambrian published in a little sidebar journal. I don't think it was done in the Intelligent Designs one in-house thing, Biocomplexity. It was in a different one. They found a little congenial little journal to publish it in. And it doesn't discuss anti-evolution per se, so that's how they could squeak it in. But 4 authors on it, of which 2 of them are young Earth creationists. As I recall, it was Marcus Ross and Paul Nelson, who are, Marcus Ross is full out, overtly young Earth creationist. Paul Nelson is a closet young Earth creationist who doesn't deny it, but boy, they certainly don't advertise it at the Discovery Institute because he's one of their fellows. John Mark Reynolds is in the same boat. He's in that bunch now, and he's a young Earth creationist. Very rare, unusual one in that he's an anti-Trumper from the Greek Orthodox persuasion, interestingly enough, which is also kind of an outlier for the Discovery Institute, which tend to be more conventional Protestants, Catholics, a lot of Catholics, and a little sprinkling of conservative Jews. Anyway, how could you possibly do a paper on the Cambrian explosion with half of your authors thinking the Cambrian took place 500 million years ago, and the other half thinking it took place 2,300 years ago? Fossilization in the flood? Do they thrash this over in the paper? Nope. Did they thrash it over in conversations over coffee before writing the paper? I'd sure love to know. And so if I ever do get a chance to ask Steve Meyer that, or for that matter, if anybody gets a chance to do an interview with Steve Meyer, if Steve Meyer shows up on Dan Stern Cardinale's show, or on Gutsick Gibbon. I'm not holding my breath on any of those possibilities, but I don't think Meyer is prone to popping up on venues where he might get asked questions outside of the softball approach. I think PragerU was much more in his line. But anyway, ask him about that bloody paper and whether there was any discussion back and forth on when the Cambrian is taking place and the taphonomy of its formation, which is radically different in the young Earth creationist context than it is in the theoretical intelligent design context, because none of them are functionally disputing, a landslide that preserves the organisms. So those are all the little demarcation and litmus things that you can do to analyze not merely what a niche ideology will agree on, but also to try to find out what they don't agree on and what topics don't come up, because often the main reason why a cockamamie ideology is wrong is not so much the overt things they're claiming up in their apologetics. It's the stuff they're leaving out that they're never thinking about. That's the really fascinating stuff. So, anyway, we're coming up on an hour in here. We've had a perfect show. Let's put up an advert for ye old book. Let me find my little rocks advert here. Let me get my little split screen here. Bump it up, rocks through there. There we go. Bump. And wait, whoops. There we go. Rocks for There. That's the book. The one that Jackson and I have done. The volume 1. The one that you can see right there. And you can get it from Amazon. You can get it in Kindle if you have that format, or hardcover or paperback. And volume 2 will be at least as bulky as volume 1. We're very proud of the work. It was fun writing it. As usual, when you dive into a subject, you learn so much about so many different things. And it's one of the reasons why I have such fun doing the work, because you learn such interesting stuff. You bump into such interesting people. I know more interesting people now than I did 10 years ago, and more 10 years ago than I do 20 years ago. Whoop, there's our little click. So grab onto that. This is there's going to be holiday times. If you've got birthdays to give out, if you've got a pile of scratch that you need to do, buy copies of the books for your libraries. Donate them if they permit you to do that. If you've got a lot of money to burn and there's somebody you really don't like who's a creationist, you can get them that book as a gift that will keep on giving, or they'll throw it out. Frankly, probably giving a creationist a book that's really pile of information like that is just going to have their brains explode, and they probably will just get furious about it. If they're full-blown Tortugan minds, they won't have their minds changed on it. So better to send it to people that will benefit from it and add it to your own library. And then, of course, we got the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg up there, which is fiction, delightful, adventure story, historical. You're taken back into the 1870s, and the other books will be moving us forward into the 1880s and the 1890s and the early 1900s and beyond. And there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on in there. And I have as much fun doing the historical work for the Paralog series that I do in the technical historical work and working out the sequencing of how creationists get all muddled up for the nonfiction work. And in many respects, it's the same dynamic that's happening in my head, even though it's a different grist mill of material. In both cases, the level of information that's available on the internet today that allows people, scholars like me, to acquire information at no cost and to discover things that would have just been a pain in the ass to try to research 20, 30 years ago. And even in many cases, only 10 or 15 years ago. Wow. So this is a golden age if we can avoid screwing the planet up climatologically and avoid having nincompoops be in power too much and avoid having any disastrous wars or depressions. That's how things really run off the rails. Q 1920s, 1930s. We don't want to do that. If we can get past those things and continue to get back on that progress to that nice Star Trek world that we want to be in, where we get build spaceships and explore things and go places where no one has gone before. That's what it is. We want to have a world that is Trek and aloha. The principle of aloha, kindness and gentility and generosity and hospitality and all of that. So Trek and aloha, no Tortugan, bad Tortugan, and no Trumpistas. So anyway, keep a watch out for your penguins. The wooden penguins can on the march, little teeny little wooden penguins down in South Africa, as opposed to the great big ones in Antarctica. But still, wooden penguins can be a potential threat that we got to watch out about. You know, they never turn your back on them. So we'll see you all next week and beyond. And thanks for everybody catching the show, and everybody stay safe. If you're in any environment where climate and weather and fires and other kinds of things are being vexing, stay careful. Okay, see you next week, kids.